One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick sat on the floor of a vacant studio apartment in the rundown apartment building where he lived and worked in northern England. The apartment building was called The Cliff, and it was across the street from the ocean in the coastal town of Seaton Carew. Carl was in the middle of painting the apartment and getting it ready for a new tenant, but he had stopped to eat some lunch and to read a few chapters of one of his favorite spy novels. Carl loved spy novels, and he had a few that he just read over and over again. But as he turned the page, something out the window caught his eye. It was his landlady, Anne Darwin, who lived in a big Victorian house right next door. And at this moment, she was standing in front of her house with her two adult sons, Anthony and Mark, and they were all dressed in black and each were holding a wreath made of flowers. And now, Carl felt a little bit like a spy himself, as he secretly watched the family of three walk across the street together to this grassy knoll that looked out over the water. Anne and her sons bowed their heads, and Carl could tell they were very likely praying, and then all three of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean. Carl knew that Anne and her sons were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin, who had actually died in a kayaking accident 2 years ago, basically in the water right out in front of their house. Carl could also see that Anne was visibly shaking, so he knew she must be crying. And when he saw that, Carl himself started to feel sad, because Carl cared deeply for Anne. He was not just her handyman and tenant. They had been secretly romantically involved ever since he had moved into the Cliff almost 2 years ago. But Carl had actually known Anne for most of his life and had been in love with her for decades. So Carl and Anne were both from a town that was near Seaton Carew, and Carl had first seen Anne on the school bus in high school, but he hadn't worked up the courage to say hello. Then soon after that, he left to go to college, but he had never stopped thinking about her. After college, Carl had started a family of his own and became a school teacher. But he lost everything after making some really bad real estate investments a few years ago. And his financial troubles had led to legal trouble, and finally he'd left his family and gone on the run from the police, living in the woods outside of Seaton Carew. That's when he and Anne had found their way back to each other. One night, in a parking lot near his campsite, Carl saw Anne pull in her car, looking very upset. And this time, he did approach her. It turned out that Anne's husband had only just had his kayaking accident a few weeks earlier, and she was obviously in a very bad place emotionally because of it. She was also desperate for help around the properties that she and her husband had owned together. So that same night, she actually let Carl move into the Cliff. And once Carl moved in, he and Anne began a somewhat unconventional romance. Carl would spend his days working to fix up the apartments inside the Cliff, and then he would spend his nights with Anne in her house. It was weird for both of them to keep their relationship secret, but they both had their reasons. For Carl, he was just afraid of being arrested if anybody knew where he was. He was on the run. And for Anne, she felt like her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow basically forever. So she didn't want to look like she basically immediately moved on from her dead husband. Now, at some point, the two of them hoped that Anne could sell her properties and that they could move far away together and start over. But they both knew that was easier said than done, because Carl would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without getting arrested. Now, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street, and he went back to reading his spy novel. And as he read the story, he made mental notes about the plot line and the main character, because Carl was actually working on a plan that maybe would allow him and Anne to start their new life together. He was actually using all of these spy novels basically as inspiration for this plan. He actually smiled to himself as he thought about how brilliant he was being. And he pictured, that someday in the future, an author would likely write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 years for Carl to finally work out his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready to put it all into action. On this morning, he walked through the airport near Seaton Carew, trying to act casual as he approached the ticketing counter. He handed his passport to the gate agent and then glanced over his shoulder, looking back to where Anne was. She was standing at the back of the line. She met his eyes, but then quickly sort of looked away because they had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other. When Carl turned back around, he saw the ticketing agent was now staring intently at his passport, and he felt his heart rate begin to pick up. So this passport that Carl was using was a fake. He had created a new identity for himself using the birth and death records of a baby that had been born in the same year as him, which was an idea from the spy novel The Day of the Jackal, about an assassin who constantly changes identities. And if it worked, he and Anne would be able to travel to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was he was going to stay there permanently if he got to Panama, and he hoped that Anne would love it enough that she would eventually move there too. Carl had read a brochure on Panama that called it a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases, which already made him feel right at home. Plus, the country was really cheap compared to the UK and far away from anyone who knew them, so he thought this was like the perfect place for them to move to. But all of that depended on this fake passport being convincing enough that the ticketing agent didn't say anything. And finally, after what felt like a very long time, the agent looked up from the passport and smiled and handed it back to Carl along with his ticket. Carl had to physically stop himself from literally sighing with relief when this happened. And instead, he just, as casually as he could, thanked the agent. And as he walked off, he turned and he sort of winked at Anne, who was still in line. After decades of reading about international spies, Carl kind of felt like one himself. And he liked this feeling a lot. And soon, he would be living permanently as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep as a real estate agent drove them through the Panamanian countryside. They sped along the highway into the jungle, and as they did, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a bend in the road, and suddenly they were driving along a sandy beach, and the realtor pulled over and said to get out and take a look and see if this plot of land felt like it could be their new home. So Carl figured that once Anne sold the cliff apartment building that she owned and combined that money with the money Anne had inherited from her husband's life insurance policies, they'd have around 600,000 pounds in savings, which was around 800,000 American dollars. Now that was more than enough money to get set up, but they were going to need some kind of income in Panama as well. And Carl wanted to buy this land in particular in the jungle and use it to open up an eco-lodge resort. Eco-lodges were becoming really popular in Central America, and tourists paid a lot of money to stay in beachside cabins for a week and go canoeing and horseback riding and jungle trekking. Carl also wanted to build a villa on the property for just him and Anne, right there on the beach. So he led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed to the tree line on the other side of the bay, and he told her to imagine a row of cabins and a dock for a bunch of canoes and a path that led to a horse stable. And then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to imagine a beautiful seaside villa where the two of them would live. Anne kicked off her sandals and walked into the water, and Carl could tell that she was picturing what their lives might look like here. To Carl, it was like years of careful planning were finally paying off. I mean, this had been like the best week of his relationship with Anne ever. They had finally been able to act like a normal couple for the first time. They had gone out in public to dinner every night together and walked down the street holding hands. Carl loved living as John Jones. He felt free. And weirdly enough, despite the fact that his identity was fake, he felt like his old self again, the way he used to feel before he got tangled up with all of his debt. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne said that she was completely taken with Panama and that, yes, she did want to move here with Carl, and that when she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and get ready for this big move. Carl beamed, and their realtor grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the moment that they had decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sell her properties in Seton Carew and to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They had all been shocked at first, but eventually they started to understand that she really needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life. Shortly afterwards, Carl bought a condominium in Panama City so that he and Anne would have a place to live while they built their resort. And then finally, on October 22nd, 2007, Anne moved to Panama permanently. However, when Carl picked her up at the airport that night and drove her to their new home, he had to fake a smile because he had recently discovered some news that was going to throw their new life into jeopardy. And so he gave Anne a quick tour of the penthouse apartment, and then he asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table. And immediately, Anne sensed something was off and looked very worried. Carl took a deep breath, and then he told Anne that he was really excited to build their resort together. But there was one last unexpected obstacle standing in the way of their dreams. He said he had only learned about this obstacle a few weeks ago, and he had been waiting for the right moment for them to talk about it. He had just found out that the Panamanian government had instituted new procedures for anyone moving to Panama from another country. And now, English citizens needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police to prove they had no criminal record. Now, this was no problem for Anne, but it was a huge problem for Carl, because he was living in Panama as John Jones. So if the police looked into his identity, they would quickly learn that John Jones was a fake identity. Anne put her head in her hands and just said, "What are we going to do?" And Carl said he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised he would figure something out. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne as they window shopped on a busy street in Panama City. And Carl thought about ways that he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in this country illegally because he was done hiding. I mean, the whole point of coming here to Panama was so that he and Anne could live together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop so that she could look at furniture. And as he wandered around the shop, he came across a bookshelf full of old books, including a few spy novels. Now, all the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't understand any of them, but he still picked one up and began flipping through it, hoping that maybe it would inspire him. And as he did this, he did feel inspired, but it was not by this book. He remembered the plotline of a different spy novel that he had read over a decade earlier. Even when he had been reading the novel at the time, he had thought that that plotline was too crazy to work in real life. But as they walked around that afternoon, Carl kept coming back to that idea, that plotline, and started to see how he might be able to make that work. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was risky, but he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, December 2nd, 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom, wandering around the West End of London. He did his best to look very confused as he walked through Christmas displays and waited until a store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. And Carl gave her a sort of shy smile and then asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" And when she said it was December, it's Christmas, that's why, he pretended to be confused about what day it was and where he was. And then he asked the clerk for some help. And just like he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern and then escorted him into the nearest police station. And she told the officer at the front desk that something was really wrong with this guy. The officer smiled at Carl and asked what the problem was. And now Carl knew that for his plan to work, he was going to have to give an award-winning acting performance here. So he kind of scratched at his head and then told the officer that he had lost his whole family. The officer sat up and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Because Carl had realized that the only way to truly feel like his old self in Panama was to actually become his old self and reclaim the old identity that he had left behind. But to reclaim this identity without also reclaiming all his old debt and legal problems was going to require one more huge lie. So Carl explained to the police officer that he knew his name, but nothing else about himself, because he said he had amnesia. The officer just stared at Carl, obviously dumbfounded. Then he turned and called for his supervisor. From this moment onward, things moved fast, but not in the direction that Carl or anyone else had expected. Carl had believed that if he just claimed he had amnesia, it'd be like wiping the slate clean in England. He could just resume his old name and his old life and make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial situation with the Eco Lodge. And he'd be able to get a real passport with his real name and live happily and truly openly in Panama. But this was not what happened, because almost immediately, newspapers caught wind of Carl's story, and it made the front page. Because to the rest of the world, Carl had this incredible story. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, never knowing his true identity. And so almost overnight, Carl became big-time international news. The entire world wanted to know, where had he been? the past few years. Now, Carl had not expected any of this publicity, so he and Anne were both horrified when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph from an obscure real estate website. And in this picture, Carl can be seen standing with Anne and their realtor and beaming with happiness after a day of viewing properties in Panama. And this photograph was very, very bad for Carl because it proved that he had not been wandering around homeless with amnesia in the UK like he had said to police. But this photo was really bad, really the worst, for Anne, because it proved something more shocking and more terrible than regular old financial fraud. This photo revealed a story so outlandish that it sounds like it must have come directly out of a fictional spy novel. Because it would turn out Anne was not the grieving widow she pretended to be, and her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick. Carl's real name, the one he had given that police officer in the UK when he pretended to have amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's dead husband. He and Anne had faked his death in that kayaking accident to escape his debt, and so that he and Anne could claim life insurance money. Not even their own kids knew that their father was still alive. Only Anne and obviously John did. John and Anne were both soon arrested for fraud and wound up serving more than 3 years in prison. John's very unhappy ending does, in some ways, mirror the ending of the very book, The Day of the Jackal, which he used for inspiration. In that book, the assassin does lots of impressive things to change his identity, but in the end, he still gets caught. Our second and final story is called Spoiler Alert. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on October 9th, 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Belogasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station on a remote island in Antarctica. The common room was like the general hangout, multi-purpose area at the station, and Oleg was in there watching TV, while his coworker, Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol, and had been for some time, because when they weren't working, there really was not much else to do besides sit around and drink. So Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months. He was part of a 14-person crew that was doing a year-round research stint, observing the island's ocean and weather patterns and collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg was primarily in charge of maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which took up most of his time. But there was still quite a bit of downtime, which Oleg spent inside, because being outside in Antarctica was generally pretty dangerous. There were hundreds of these lethal, deep ice crevasses that you could barely see, that if you fell into, you're dead, couldn't get out again, or the fall alone would kill you. Obviously freezing temperatures, there's lethal, violent blizzards. I mean, this is not a place built for people. So Oleg and his coworkers really only went outside when their work required it. Otherwise, they stayed put. But inside any of the various buildings at the station, their entertainment options were limited. I mean, there was just this 2-channel TV set, there was a small gym, there was a nearby church, and there was a library. And at this point, Oleg was pretty much sick of everything. I mean, he was even tired of the library. And he loved to read. But the library was really small, and he'd basically read pretty much all the books that were in there. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting right next to him, he loved reading too. And books were something they both spent a lot of time talking about. So, since Oleg wasn't finding anything good to watch on TV and was feeling bored and kind of stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei wanted to get into one of their deep literary conversations. And so Oleg turned off the TV and tossed the remote into the chair and took a swig of his drink, and then he glanced over to the corner where Sergei was reading the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read Fight Club. It was about this depressed man with insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts this secret club where people literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had an epic plot twist at the end. And so Oleg walked over and asked what Sergei thought of the book so far. but Sergey just kind of ignored him. But Oleg wasn't surprised. He knew Sergey really well, since the two of them had worked very closely together on various research projects over the years. So he knew Sergey was generally a very quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved getting into big, long, passionate discussions. Sometimes Oleg could get Sergey to open up by asking questions and telling jokes, but today did not seem to be one of those days. Now, this was definitely frustrating for Oleg, but he could tell, Sergey wanted to be left alone, so he stood up and left to go find something else to do. Oleg spent some time just kind of wandering around the station, checking research logs and sipping his drink. He thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air, but when he checked the temperature, he saw that it was below freezing, so he decided against it. And so after 3 hours of trying to kill time, Oleg finally just headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 p.m. when Oleg stepped into the dining room, feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he'd been drinking. And the first thing he saw when he got inside of there was Sergey. And Sergey was at a table, still reading Fight Club, just like he'd been doing earlier in the common room. So Oleg got some food and went over to sit with Sergey and see if now, maybe, he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, Sergey was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey put his book down and looked up, ready to talk, possibly because he'd also had a lot to drink and was feeling kind of chatty. And so the two men began discussing the book, Fight Club. And quickly, their conversation got really energetic because they were both, drunk and excited about what they were saying. And then Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic point about the book and what it all meant. To Oleg, it seemed like everything was going great. But all of a sudden, after making this point, Oleg noticed that Sergey had gone really quiet. And Oleg, who could read Sergey well by this point, knew what this meant. Sergey was done talking and wanted some space. So Oleg looked down at his watch. He actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over, and he was about to look up and tell Sergey that he was going to go leave and check one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergey was gone. And at that same exact moment, a wild scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building, the research station's manager was in his office going through some paperwork when his door suddenly flew open. And when the manager looked up, he saw that one of his employees was standing in the doorway looking completely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide and his breath was ragged, like he was in shock. And when the employee explained why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the employee not to move. He then grabbed his coat and flew out the door into the freezing cold. The manager pulled on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground to the building where the cafeteria was. And the whole way, he just felt his panic growing and growing because what that employee had just said had never, ever happened at their research station before. He wasn't even sure if it had happened in the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally got to the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside, and immediately he felt sick to his stomach. It would turn out Oleg and Sergey had been co-workers for a long, long time. And they did know each other really well. And what that meant was they knew each other so well that Oleg had sort of learned what specifically really annoyed Sergey. And Oleg used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergey was by violating a serious rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Even if you've never heard the rule explicitly, you know you don't do this. Every time Sergey would start a new book, Oleg would wait until he got about halfway through and then tell him the ending. This was not just a one-time thing. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly ruined them for Sergey, which always made Sergey really, really mad. And that day in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergey, he didn't just make a great point about Fight Club. He told Sergey how it ended. And don't worry, if you haven't read it or you haven't seen the movie, we are not going to ruin the twist for you because it is amazing. You should check it out. But Oleg did. And Sergey was very drunk. And like Oleg, he had also been very restless and tense from having been cooped up in this isolated station for months on end. And so this time, when Oleg told him the ending, Sergei completely snapped. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen, walked behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did ya?" Once Sergei calmed down, he was so shocked by what he'd done that he immediately turned himself in to the station's manager. He was then transported back to Russia and arrested, but he was eventually acquitted since he had no previous record. Oleg's heart was damaged in the attack, but amazingly, he would survive after being transported to a hospital. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman who we'll call Olivia met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in Western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had had some alcohol, but not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident. And so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later, they pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, "Oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though." But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, "Hey, ma'am, have you been drinking tonight?" And she would tell them that, "Well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours, and I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk." But the police were not buying it, and so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100, and while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 0.08% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 0.2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning, and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 0.4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, and so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. And so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again, and again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, But regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called autobrewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert, and as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards, and he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer, and then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around, and then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past, and then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed. And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards until 2009. That year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move, sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we gotta move. April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding and they had driven down this dead-end road and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Ed Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched the samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty. But he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him. And there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror. So that's... In 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald was living in a small rural town in southern Australia called Budgeree. He lived there with his parents, who owned a small house on a massive 1,200-acre plot of land, which for reference is about 2 square miles. However, this land was made up mostly of thick brush and forested areas, so for the most part, they just stayed close to their actual house. However, there was a waterfall deep into the woods on their property that periodically they would go to visit. Less than a 20-minute drive north of Budgeree was another small rural town called Churchill, and in that town was Julian's girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who also lived with her parents. The young couple had met 2 years earlier at the church they both went to. They were both very devout Christians, and their plan was to get married the next year when Carolyn turned 18 and was done with her studies. On Tuesday, March 4th of that year, Julian and Carolyn decided to go out and have a picnic lunch at the waterfall on Julian's family's property. So early that afternoon, Julian left his house, he hopped in the family car, he drove north to Churchill, he picked up Carolyn, and then he drove her back to his family's property, where he turned onto a dirt road that would take them into the forest to the waterfall. At some point along this short, bumpy road through the forest, Julian was looking out ahead of the car when he spotted what looked like roadkill on the side of the road. And this roadkill, it looked bigger than he was used to seeing in this area. And so he stared at it as the car kind of rolled past it. And right after they had driven past the roadkill, he turned to Carolyn and said, you know, hey, there's some really weird roadkill on the side of the road right over there. And so Carolyn, who really didn't care, she kind of slowly looked up and turned around and looked, but she didn't see it. And then after that, the two of them did not discuss the roadkill any further. And so Julian just continued to drive along this dirt road until the road kind of opened up into this big clearing. And in the middle of this clearing, which was basically this field, there was a small pond with a 10-foot high waterfall feeding into it. This was the waterfall. And so Julian parked the car right at the end of the dirt road, right on the edge of this clearing. And he and Carolyn got out. They went around to the back of the car. They got their picnic supplies out of the trunk, and they set up their picnic lunch right on the edge of this pond, looking up at this waterfall. And they were there for about an hour, just kind of enjoying each other's company. And then around 2:30 p.m., they realized it was time to go because they had told their family they'd be back by 3. And so they packed up all of their picnic stuff. They went back to the car. They put it back in the trunk. They hopped back inside the car. Julian turned it on. He turned the car around, and they began driving back down the dirt road that had brought them in. And as soon as they began driving down this road, Julian remembered the strange roadkill he had seen on their way in. And he decided that he wanted to stop and get out and actually go up to it. And so as they're driving along, he looks over at Carolyn and says, hey, do you mind if I stop the car when I see the roadkill so I can go look at it? And Carolyn looked at him and she's like, okay, but remember, we have to be back by 3 p.m. That's what we told our families, so please be quick. And so Julian said, no problem. And so he continued driving along, scanning for this roadkill. But after driving for several minutes, he had not found the roadkill yet. And he started to become worried that he had just driven past it without realizing it. And so he stopped the car. They're pretty close to the end of this dirt road. They're almost back to Julian's property. But he stops the car right in the middle of this dirt road. And he turns to Carolyn and says, hey, you know, I think I drove past past it. Do you mind if I just hop out and run back? And so Carolyn was totally annoyed that this roadkill viewing was really becoming quite involved. But she says, okay, go. But again, you got to be quick because, it's almost 3 p.m. And so Julian kind of grinned at her. He put the car in park and he hopped out, he turned, and he began jogging back down the road in the direction of the waterfall. And after jogging for maybe 30 seconds or so, the road had turned to the right. And so from where he was on the road, if he turned around, he would not have been able to see his car or Carolyn. He was kind of deep in the thick of this forest. But he knew, this road is not very long, and so I'm sure the roadkill has got to be up here somewhere. And so he decided he would just continue running back along this road for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and if he didn't find the roadkill by then, he'd just have to give up, turn around, and head back to the car. And so he began jogging, continuing towards the waterfall on this dirt road, and sure enough, after about a minute, he spots off to the side the roadkill. And so he runs up to it, and right away he sees it's this huge animal that's right on the side of the road. There was a branch from a tree that had kind of obscured the carcass a little bit, and he figured that's why on the return trip he hadn't seen it, because this branch was kind of blocking it from view. And so standing over it, still not even sure what it is, he reached down and he moved the branch, the tree branch, out of the way to get a better look at this big dead animal. And right as he did that, everything went black. A few minutes later, Carolyn, who was still sitting in the car waiting for her boyfriend to come back, looked at her watch and realized it was getting really close to 3 p.m. and still Julian was not back yet. And so feeling kind of annoyed with him, she sat up in her seat and turned around and looked out the rear window of the car, expecting to see Julian come bounding down the road toward her. But when she looked out the back window, all she saw was this dirt road that kind of bent off to the right out of view and thick trees everywhere. Her boyfriend is nowhere to be seen. Annoyed, she turned back around and sat facing forward again, but began periodically looking in the side view mirror, expecting Julian to pop up at any moment. But after several more minutes went by and still Julian had not come back yet, her annoyance turned into concern. Was Julian actually okay? And so she decided, it's almost 3 p.m. now. We got to get back. I need to get out and actually go investigate and see what's going on with Julian and this roadkill. And so she opened her car door, she stepped outside, she stood up, she turned, and she looked down the road in the direction it turned to the right towards the waterfall, and she froze because there was something standing right in the middle of the road that her brain simply couldn't process. She wanted to turn and run. She wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't. She was just frozen with fear, staring at this thing in the middle of the road. And then seconds later, this thing that she saw in the road began moving toward her. Around 3:30 p.m. that day, Julian's mother, who was at the house, realized her son had still not come back from his picnic. And this was very unlike him. He was extremely punctual. And so she stepped out onto the front porch to wait for him. But after waiting on the front porch for 30 minutes and him not showing up again, she got really concerned. And so she left the porch and went down onto their driveway, and their driveway extended right up to the main road that ran along the front of the house. And when she reached the top of her driveway, she just turned and watched down the main road, waiting for her son to come back. Because in order to get to the waterfall, you had to get on this main road and then turn onto that dirt road that was a little ways down this main road. And so she's just standing there looking down the road, waiting for her son, but he's still not coming out of that dirt road. And as she's looking in this direction, she happens to glance along the chain link fence that ran along the front of her property. And she noticed there was a plastic bottle that had been jammed through one of the chain links. And so she decided she would just go over and see what it was, because it didn't make any sense that there would be a bottle in her fence. And so she walks over, she pulls the bottle out of the fence, and she realizes there is a tightly rolled piece of paper that's inside of the bottle. And so she unscrews the cap, she turns the bottle over, and she pours this little piece of paper out. She unfurls the piece of paper and sees there's writing on it. And as she's reading it, her heart starts to race and she covers her mouth. This note was clearly intended for her to read, or someone in the family to read that day, because it was about what happened to Julian and Carolyn that day. The note, which was covered in all these strange satanic symbols and was barely understandable because the grammar and spelling was so terrible, it generally communicated that Julian and Carolyn, who they called the boy and the girl, had been kidnapped. And so long as the family did not contact police, they, the boy and the girl, Julian and Carolyn, would be returned. It didn't really specify what they were going to do to them, and there was no ransom. It basically just said, you better not tell police or else. Well, Julian's mother was terrified. She had no idea what to do, and despite this threat of some sort of harm to her children, to her family, if she went to police, she still called the police. And so the police, they came out to her property, they inspected the note, and right away, they noticed at the bottom of the note, it was signed with the initials O-N-A. And so those initials, combined with these strange satanic symbols all over it, led police to discover who O-N-A was. O-N-A was a cult. It was the Order of Nine Angles, and they are a self-professed satanic cult that operates primarily in Europe, but also has chapters in the United States, in Canada, in Russia, and also in Australia. This cult believes that Christians are the enemy of the world, and they need to be destroyed in order to institute a militaristic New World Order they called the Imperium. And if that wasn't frightening enough, this cult openly advocates for, and apparently practices, human sacrifice. They have come out and said the people they kill in these sacrifices are people they consider lesser thans, basically the bad people of society. And if you are an O-N-A cult member, then who better to sacrifice than Julian and Carolyn, two devout Christians, and so two clear enemies of the O-N-A. Now, at first, when the police saw this note and kind of put this together, they're thinking, this has got to be a prank. I mean, Carolyn and Julian have only been gone for a couple of hours at this point, and all we have is this note in a bottle stuck into the fence. This does not seem like some huge conspiracy of a cult coming in here and snatching these kids to commit some human sacrifice. But when Carolyn's parents found out about this note and how they were still missing, they would tell the police, 10 days ago, we received a letter in the mail that had strange satanic symbols all over it, and it really didn't make any sense. It basically was threatening them not to go to police, but 10 days ago, they had no reason to go to police, and so they just didn't really understand why they received this message or who had sent it, and so they had just kind of dismissed it and not told anyone. But now, with these two notes looking nearly identical, it seemed fairly obvious that whether it was the O-N-A or some other person or group, whoever was behind the kidnapping of Julian and Carolyn had clearly been watching both of their properties prior to the attack, which meant this was likely a more sophisticated kidnapping than it seemed. So that evening, the police launched this huge air and land search all over Julian's family's property, but despite looking everywhere, they found no sign of the young couple. There was just nothing. And over the next few days, when still there was just no sign of Julian or Carolyn, and there was no more word coming in from O-N-A, there were no more bottles stuck in fences or stuck in mailboxes, the police began to prepare for the worst. Then something totally unexpected happened. On March 11th, so 7 days after Carolyn and Julian went missing, a farmer was driving along this winding back road up in the mountains right near Alpine National Park. Alpine National Park is this very rugged, mountainous place that's about 250 miles to the north of Budgery. And so as this guy is driving along this road, which is very heavily forested on either side, he sees up ahead this young man and young woman who are barely wearing any clothes, come stumbling out of the forest and kind of plop down on the side of the road. And so concerned they're hurt or they're lost or something, the farmer rolled right up next to them and he rolled his window down and asked, hey, are you guys okay? And they got up and they kind of stumbled their way over to the car and they introduced themselves as Carolyn and Julian and they pleaded for his help. And so the farmer helped them into his car and he drove them to the hospital. It wasn't long before the police in Budgery learned that Carolyn and Julian had been found and they were alive. And so very quickly, they rushed up to that hospital near the national park. And when they got there, they spoke to doctors who would say, Carolyn and Julian are very traumatized. They're horribly sunburned. They're covered in bug bites. They got cuts and bruises all over them, but they're okay. They're going to survive. And so the police went into Julian and Carolyn's room. And at first, they just talked to them for a couple of minutes to really see that they were okay. And after feeling pretty confident that they were, they said, look, I don't mean to just jump right into the trauma trauma you've just experienced. But we really need any information you can give us about what just happened. Who did this to you? Who brought you out here? Because if it's ONA and they're out in the Alpine National Park, we need to know about it. We need to get out there and we need to stop them. And so Julian and Carolyn would both independently sit down and tell the police what happened to them. And so the following is the combined story of these two accounts that they gave police. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Current. Banking is one of the few industries that has yet to be modernized by technology. It's dominated by a bunch of old companies that would happily take you out on a nice seafood dinner and never call you again. But with Current, which is the future of money management, you'd get that call back, and they'll even give you directions to Bell's Canyon. Because Current was built from the ground up with you in mind. They want you to get your money faster, they want you to move your money faster, and they have the tools to help you spend and save your money better than ever. With Current, there are a bunch of perks, but a few of them include getting your paycheck 2 days earlier, not getting charged overdraft fees up to $200, and there are no minimum balance fees. Also, Current's savings plan, just called Interest, comes with a whopping 4% APY, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times the American national average. And if that wasn't incentive enough, Current and I are once again giving away $500 to 10 of you. All you gotta do is sign up using my code BALLEN500. So go download Current today and use my code BALLEN500 for a chance to win the money. Okay, back to the story. And so again, here is the account that both Julian and Carolyn gave to police. 7 days earlier, when Julian had gotten out of the car and ran back down the road to that dead animal on the side of the road, and he had reached down to kind of get that branch out of the way to get a better look at this thing, he heard sudden movement behind him, and as he turned, he didn't have a chance to see what was behind him, but he felt something hard smash him in the back of the head, and it knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he knew right away that a significant amount of time had passed, that he had been unconscious for what must have been several hours, because now it was dark out, and when he was struck, it was broad daylight, and he looked around him and he had no idea where he was. He was in the middle of this forest, he had no clothes on, his wrists and his ankles were tied together, and he moved around and he realized he had been tied to a tree that was right behind him. And so he's got no idea what's going on, he has no idea where he is, he's looking around, he doesn't see anyone, and then amazingly, when he looks down, right next to him, underneath some leaves, is a knife. And so he's thinking, how in the world is there a knife right next to me? This almost seems like it was placed to be here for me. But either way, he reaches down with his hands, he picks this knife up, and he's able to cut the restraints off of his ankles, and then he's able to cut the restraints off of his waist, and then he stands up and he's able to kind of cut off the ones on his wrist, and then he's free. And so he takes this knife and he has no idea where he's going, but he needs to get away. He doesn't know if whoever brought him here is going to come back. And so he just picks a direction and he starts running. Shortly after Julian had been struck in the back of the head after looking at that dead animal carcass, Carolyn was still sitting in the car and she was starting to get annoyed and kind of worried about Julian. And so she gets out of the car, she stands up, she turns, and she looks down the dirt road where it kind of bends off to the right. And standing in the road, maybe 10 feet away from her, is this man wearing all black. He's got a black balaclava over his face, and he's looking right at her. And so she's so scared, she's just frozen to the spot. And then this guy charges her, he tackles her to the ground, and then once she's on the ground, he rips all her clothes off, and then he binds her wrists, her ankles, he ties them together, so she's hogtied, and then he puts a blindfold around her eyes. And so she's lying on the road, she can't move, she can't see anything, and she hears her attacker run off down the road. And then a couple of minutes later, she hears a car approaching and it stops right near her. And then she hears the sound of a car door opening, someone walking up to her, and then they pick her up and they put her in the trunk of this car. They shut the trunk, and then the car kicks into gear and it starts driving away. And so for hours and hours, she lay in the trunk in this horrible position where the circulation to her wrists and to her ankles were cut off. And so she's getting shooting pain in her limbs, and it's totally uncomfortable. And then after several hours, the car eventually turns on to some really bumpy road, and then it comes to a stop. And then she hears the sound of the driver open the door. They walk around to the back of the car. The trunk pops open. And then this person pulls the blindfold off of her eyes. And she sees, even though her eyes are taking a second to adjust, that it's the man with the balaclava on. And he picks her up and he throws her on the ground. And then after he shuts the trunk, he walks over to Carolyn and he grabs her by the wrists and he begins dragging her into the woods. And so as she's being dragged, Carolyn is thinking, I'm about to be killed somewhere in the middle of the woods. There's nothing I can do. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And after several minutes of being dragged, she gets dropped. And then this man with the balaclava, he walks back to the car and he gets a shovel. And when he walks over to her, he makes a special point of showing her the shovel. And then he rolls her onto her side so she's positioned in such a way that she can see what he's doing. And then right in front of her, he takes that shovel and he begins digging a hole in the ground. And so Carolyn's watching him and she's thinking, he's digging my grave. And so for several hours, Carolyn just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her as this guy dug this hole deeper and deeper into the ground. And then finally, when the hole was apparently deep enough, the guy got out of the hole, he dumped the shovel, he walked over to her, he picked her up, and he threw her into the hole. And so Carolyn at this point is literally anticipating death at any moment. She doesn't know how he's going to kill her, but she thinks it's going to happen any minute. And so she wriggles herself onto her knees and does the only thing she can think to do, which is just to pray. And so as she's sitting there kneeling and praying, she hears the sound of her attacker walking off. Now, the hole was deep enough that she actually could not see where he was going, but she could clearly tell he was walking away. It was almost like her prayer had been answered, that this guy was going to leave her alone. But even with this guy potentially gone, she was still in a perilous situation because she's stuck in this hole. She can't go anywhere. She's still tied up, and the temperatures are dropping rapidly, and she's got no clothes on. After Julian had managed to free himself from his restraints with that knife that he found, and after he had turned and just started running in a general direction, he had begun yelling out for help. He knew that by yelling out, he very likely could be alerting the person who had brought him here. But he's thinking, it's freezing, I don't have clothes on, I have to get help right now. And maybe Carolyn is out there. And so he's just kind of yelling out for help. And at some point, a voice yells back to him, and it's a voice he knows very well. It's Carolyn. And so in the darkness, he's kind of fumbling through all the trees and he's listening for Carolyn's voice. And finally, he reaches her and he finds her in this hole, hogtied, screaming out for him. And so there's this moment where he kind of explains what happened to him, and she's trying to explain what happened to her, but they're just so scared that this attacker is going to come back that Julian just hops into the hole, he cuts her restraints, and then Julian helps Carolyn out of the hole. And at this point, Carolyn can barely walk because the circulation had been cut off for the most part to her legs for the better part of 6, 7, 8 hours at this point. But still, they're desperate to get out of here. So Julian's kind of holding Carolyn up, and they begin to walk away from this hole site. And as they're leaving, they begin scanning around the area in case, this attacker has left something else on the ground, because Julian had said, I found a knife near where I was being held. And sure enough, as they're leaving, not far from the hole, they spot lying up against a tree a sleeping bag, and rolled up inside of the sleeping bag was some food and some water. And so Julian and Carolyn, they can't understand how in the world this has happened. Both the horrible luck of being kidnapped and brought out here, and the unbelievable luck of finding life-saving supplies just laying nearby. But either way, they grab the sleeping bag, they grab the food and water, and they take off running. For the next 48 hours, the couple roasted during the daytime when the sun was out because the temperatures would climb significantly. There wasn't much shade where they were walking around, so they're getting horribly sunburned. And then at night, the temperatures would plummet and they'd be freezing cold, and they'd get inside of their one sleeping bag and they'd shiver together and do their best to ration some food and water. And they're telling themselves, to stay positive, that eventually if they just keep on moving every day, they're going to find a person, they're going to find a road, they're going to find something that will save them. But to their horror, at the end of those first 48 hours, as they're stumbling through this mountainous, treacherous terrain, they found themselves stumbling back into the same area they had tried to run away from. There was the hole in the ground where Carolyn had been thrown inside of. They had accidentally, over the past 2 days, walked in a big circle. Now, luckily, when they arrived back at this site, there was no one there. The attacker was long gone, and it would turn out this accident likely
completely saved their lives, because as they looked at this site, they saw propped up against a tree was a backpack. And so they ran over to the backpack, they opened it up, and there was food, water, some clothing, and a map of the area. Now, again, the couple is totally dumbfounded why they are just happening to find these life-saving supplies right when they need them. But at the same time, they're thinking, okay, well, if these supplies are sitting here, then certainly the person who has left them here, their attacker, they're going to be back soon. And so they just grabbed the backpack with everything inside of it and they took off running. And for the next 5 days, they used that map as best as they could, and they eventually stumbled their way through the terrain, roasting during the daytime and freezing at night. And eventually they reached that road where they stumbled out, and the farmer driving along the back road, he spotted them and he brought them to the hospital. After hearing this story, the police very quickly organized a massive search around the area of Alpine National Park where the farmer picked up Julian and Carolyn, because they're thinking, okay, it's got to be right around here that we'll find the man in the balaclava that might lead us to the ONA, or maybe he's not connected to the ONA, but whoever he is, we need to find this guy. And so the police, they go out, they do this huge search. They don't find the man with the balaclava. They don't find any sign of the ONA, but they do find that area where that hole had been dug that Carolyn had been thrown in. And when they searched that area, they found the shovel, they found some rope, and they found some duct tape. And when they brought that in to be examined, they couldn't believe what they discovered. All of those items belonged to Julian, which meant either the kidnapper had taken all of these supplies from Julian right before going out and perpetrating this kidnapping, or, much more likely, Julian had supplied these things to the kidnapper and so was involved in some way in this kidnapping. And so the police went to Julian and confronted him with this information and said, "You're not telling us everything because these are your items." And at first, Julian would completely deny any accusations that he had anything to do with this. But after some very serious police pressure was put on him, he cracked. The following is the real story of what happened. Back on March 4th, so the day that Julian and Carolyn went missing, Julian, after picking Carolyn up, they made it onto that dirt road that led into the forest towards the waterfall, and as they're driving along, Julian claimed to have seen some roadkill, some very strange roadkill on the side of the road. And so when Carolyn kind of turned around to look and didn't see it, Julian made it seem like, oh, we drove past it, that's why you didn't see it. But in reality, there was never any roadkill. That was completely made up. There was no roadkill. All Julian was doing was creating something that would allow him to then get out of the car at the end of their trip. And so they drive the rest of the way into the waterfall, they have their picnic, they turn around, they head back, and then again, Julian says, "Hey, Carolyn, do you mind if I, get out to look at the roadkill?" And so she says yes, and then he acts like, "Oh, we must have driven past it, so I need to get out and run back if I want to go see it." So Carolyn, she's not thinking it's totally strange. She says, okay, and so he hops out and he runs his way, he goes around that curve in the road, out of sight. There's no roadkill. Instead, he makes his way to a tree where days earlier he had stashed his all-black outfit, his black balaclava, and his knife, his shovel, his rope, his duct tape. It was all stashed in this spot that was going to be out of view of where Carolyn was. And so after getting all dressed up, he turned and began walking back towards Carolyn and his car. And when he turned the corner, he saw Carolyn was already standing outside of the car. And so he charged her, he tackled her to the ground, he ripped her clothes off, he hog-tied her, he threw her in his car, and then he got all of his supplies, he threw those in the car too, and he began driving away. And for 6 hours, he drove north all the way up to Alpine National Park, and then when he got there, he found a road that would kind of go off the trail a ways into the forest, at which point he opened the trunk, he pulled Carolyn out, he threw her on the ground, he dragged Carolyn into the woods, and then with her blindfold off, he made sure to show her the shovel, and he began digging that hole to give her the impression that he was going to kill her and bury her. He really wanted her to be totally terrified. And then after he had dug this hole, he dumped her into the hole. And then when she couldn't see what he was doing because she's deep inside of this hole and she's all tied up, he ran away. And when he was far enough out of view, he took off all of his clothes and kind of stashed it near a tree. And then completely naked, besides his knife, which would be his alibi for how he had gotten free, he began moving back towards the site where he knew Carolyn was in this hole. And then after waiting a little bit, he began yelling out for help. and then she heard it. And so she yells back to him, "Yo, Julian, I'm over here." And so Julian goes to the sound of her voice, and then when he sees her, he pitches her this ridiculous story about how he was tied up over there, but he found this knife, and he was able to cut himself free, and look, I'll cut you free. Oh, the attacker's gonna come back soon. And so he helps her out of the hole, and oh, look, they left a sleeping bag and some food and water, let's go. And so he grabs the supplies and they head off into the bush. Now, the whole time, over the course of these 7 days, Julian knew exactly where he was. And so when they accidentally went in a circle and arrived back at the site where the hole was and then found that backpack that had more food and more water and some more supplies, that was intentional. That was not an accident. He had left the backpack there, and so that's why they had doubled back. And then 5 days later, after scampering through the wilderness, they magically found the road. But again, Julian knew where the road was. He had intentionally stayed out for the days that they were out there. And so after Julian tells the police all this, they say to him, was Carolyn in on this? I mean, did she know this was going on? And he said no. The whole time she believed they were getting stalked by their attacker. And if they ever caught up to them, they would be killed. And so the police are like, okay, well, why did you do this? Julian would say, he and Carolyn were both very committed to their faith, and they both believed in not having sex before marriage. But over time, Julian had gotten to the point where he just couldn't wait any longer to have sex with Carolyn, and they weren't scheduled to get married for another year. And he just did not think he could wait a full year before they could finally have intercourse. And so he had staged this entire kidnapping in order to hopefully coerce Carolyn into having sex with him. And so while he and Carolyn were out on the run in Alpine National Park for those 7 days and nights, they were not wearing any clothes or barely wearing any clothes. And at night, they only had that one sleeping bag that Julian had intentionally staged in advance. He knew they would have that one sleeping bag. And so they would climb into that bag at night because it's freezing cold out. And as they're laying there right on top of each other, he would say to Carolyn, "We need to have sex in order to produce enough heat that we don't freeze to death out here." But Carolyn, despite the circumstances, every time said no. And so after 7 days of trying to convince Carolyn that they had to have sex, it was a matter of life or death, and that if they just said their vows, that under the eyes of God, they would be considered married and sex would be okay at that point, despite all of his best efforts, every single time, Carolyn just continued to say no, no, no. And so at the end of those 7 days, Julian finally just gave up. And so that's when they magically made their way out to the road and were rescued. Julian would also tell police that he was the one who wrote those notes prior to the kidnapping in hopes that they would believe the Order of the Nine Angles was behind all of this and he wouldn't get in trouble. Prior to his trial for kidnapping, Julian was out on bail and he decided he would just try to flee Australia. And so the way he did this is he dyed his skin a darker shade, and he also dyed his hair darker, and then he attempted to use a fake Indian passport to go to India. And he was able to fool Australian authorities, but when he arrived in India, he was immediately found out and he was extradited back to Australia where he would stand trial. And in 2009, he was found guilty of kidnapping along with a host of other obscure charges, and he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months in prison. A popular YouTuber named Dan Bell explores abandoned buildings and then uploads that footage to his very popular This Is Dan Bell page that has over 500,000 subscribers. Unlike other urban exploration YouTube channels, Dan is not trying to create scary content. In fact, many of his most popular videos are taken in buildings that haven't even been abandoned yet, like in a Kmart that's shutting down and all the shelves are empty, and he walks around and it's kind of eerie because it's this huge store that's now coming to an end. But again, it's not really scary. But amongst those popular videos, there is one that is horrifying, and it's called the Super Creepy Abandoned Asylum. One of the top comments on this video is from a verified YouTube account with over 1 million subscribers. They're called The Proper People, and they say, "This may be the creepiest urban exploration video I have ever seen." The video opens with Dan coming up to this huge old house that looks like nature is reclaiming it with all the vines and grass and everything overgrown all around it. And for the first minute and a half, Dan is just quietly walking around the
perimeter of this building. And you don't really know what it is, besides obviously the captions given away, it's an asylum, but it doesn't look like an asylum. It looks like a random house in the middle of the woods. After about a minute and a half, Dan makes his way over to the side of this building, and he sees there are some stone steps that go down into a door that clearly feeds into the basement of this building. Dan walks down the stairs, he opens the door, and he walks into this hallway, and as soon as he goes in, because his camera had been filming in very bright sunshine outside, it takes a minute for it to focus on the hallway, which is totally dark. But once the camera focuses, you see all this old clothing strewn about on the ground, and the paint is peeling off the walls in every part of the building. When Dan filmed this, he was not out loud narrating as he walked around the building. Instead, while he was editing the footage, he must have recorded himself doing a narration, and that narration picks up as soon as he gets in the hallway and the camera has focused. He begins walking down this hallway, and you hear under his boots the crunch of broken glass, and as he's walking, you hear Dan's voice say, "This is a children's asylum that shut down sometime in the 1990s. It was briefly leased sometime in the 2000s, but for the most part, over the past 3 decades, this building has been totally abandoned." After he gives this brief history, which sounds like he's done this dozens of times on other videos, he pauses and says, "You know, something really strange happened while I was filming inside of this building." He heard what sounded like someone running around on the top floor of this building. He's used to going into abandoned buildings and finding creatures, animals running around. That was not unusual. And so instinctively, he assumes it's got to be some animal that's taken up residence on the top floor. And so he doesn't worry about it. He ends up walking around the whole first floor before making his way upstairs. And he said when he got up there, he was expecting to see some animal or some sign of an animal living up there, but he didn't. He didn't see anything. It just looked like every other abandoned building. And after filming what he wanted to film, he eventually leaves the building and goes home. It wasn't until he loaded the footage onto his computer and began reviewing it that he noticed 2 specific instances while he was inside this asylum where clearly someone else is in the room with him. Dan speculates that perhaps a former patient has come back here and is living in one of the rooms upstairs. Here are the 2 segments from his video that show this kind of phantom person lurking in the shadows. In the first clip, keep your eyes on the door that is open leading downstairs. You'll see there is a shadow on the door that is being cast from whatever is standing at the top of the stairs just outside of our view. And at some point, as Dan is filming down the hall, that shadow vanishes down the stairs. In the second clip, when Dan walks into the room, look to the back left-hand side of the room at the door, specifically at the open hole where there should be a doorknob. You will see there is very clearly someone looking through the hole at Dan, and when Dan films this person, they run away. Missy Beavers was a wife, a mother of 3 girls, and a hardcore fitness instructor. She lived in Midlothian, Texas, and she taught a fitness boot camp out of a local church at least 1 day a week, every week. Missy was extremely bubbly and outgoing, and everybody seemed to really like her, and her personality really shined on social media, where she was an avid Facebook user, often posting multiple times a day, every day of the week. Missy would post information about upcoming fitness classes, either that she was teaching or that she was simply participating in. She would also post her own fitness regimen and her diet. She was just very focused on health. She also shared fairly personal things, like pictures of her family and where they were going and what they were up to. And she left her personal cell phone right on her Facebook page. So clearly, Missy was fine with kind of being out there. On April 17th, 2016, there was a weather report that came in that the next day there was going to be really, really heavy rain, in particular in the morning. And Missy's class was scheduled for the next morning at 5 a.m. and she started getting calls and text messages from the people who were going to that class asking, is this class still going to happen? By 7:55 p.m. that night, so many people had asked about it that she decided to just put a
public post on her Facebook page addressing the weather. And it just said, "If it's raining, we're still training. No excuses. You are gladiators." On the post, she included directions of how to get to the church, where this class was going to be in the church, what time they were starting, and what they could expect. Later that night at 9:23 p.m., she did another Facebook post that said, "Going to bed. I have to get up tomorrow at 3:30. The next day at 4:16 in the morning, a street security camera picked up Missy pulling into the church's parking lot. Even though her class didn't start until 5 a.m., she liked to get there early to make sure the classroom was set up and to warm up a little bit and make sure she was super motivated and cheerful as soon as they walked in. The security cameras inside the church capture Missy walking in through the front doors at 4:20 in the morning. Then, just before 5 a.m., the first couple of students arrived at the classroom and they walk in to find Missy laying on the ground, bleeding from her head, totally unresponsive. They call 911, police and paramedics show up, and as soon as they get there, they pronounce Missy dead. Initially, there was some speculation that she might have fallen and hit her head, but they noticed all these puncture marks in her head that looked intentionally inflicted, like someone had struck her. And later, when they reviewed the security footage from inside the church, it was confirmed that she definitely was murdered. Earlier that morning at 3:50 a.m., so 26 minutes before Missy arrives in the church parking lot, an unknown figure wearing police tactical gear from head to toe breaks into the church. From 3:50 in the morning when they first get inside the church to 4:20 in the morning when Missy walks through the front doors, this unknown figure just kind of strolls casually up and down the halls of this church. It looked like they were carrying a hammer or perhaps a crowbar, and periodically as they're kind of casually walking down the hall, they would turn to a window of a door and they would break it with whatever they're holding in their hand, and then they would just keep walking on. Like there was no reason for them to break the window, they're just bored. And this was actually an important point that police would make about this footage. This person walking around does not appear to want to vandalize the church. I mean, they're breaking a couple windows, but they could have done a lot more damage to the building, and they didn't. They don't appear to be looking to steal anything, and in fact, later, police would confirm that nothing was stolen. What it looks like they're doing is just kind of wasting time, like they have some clear objective for being here, but they can't do it quite yet. They're waiting for a trigger of some kind, and it would turn out that that trigger was Missy walking through those doors at 4:20 in the morning. As soon as Missy made her way into the classroom, the assailant followed her and proceeded to beat her to death with whatever they were holding in their hand. By the time police arrived a little after 5 a.m., the suspect was long gone. Initially, police believed it was going to be fairly easy to identify who killed Missy. The person on camera wearing the tactical gear had a very distinctive gait with their feet turned out, and they walked with a bit of a limp, and they had very slouched posture. And the police figured as soon as we put this surveillance footage out in the public domain, someone's going to come forward and say they recognize this person. But despite the hundreds of leads that poured in from people after watching this video saying, "Oh yeah, I know this person," well, the police checked into all of them and they all checked out. Everybody had an alibi. And so years later, the police are still not able to identify who killed Missy or why, and so her case remains unsolved. Here is the security footage of Missy's killer casually walking around the halls, aimlessly smashing windows and opening doors, just waiting for Missy to show up. In March of 2015, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer.
Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, you gotta go. And Tamara just says, no, I'm not leaving. This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't, and they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then, of course, the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, you shouldn't even be here, you need to leave. And Tamara's like, no, I'm not gonna leave. And so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, okay, I get it. I need to leave, just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair. Immediately, the tension is gone in the room, they're no longer fighting, and Valentina is happy that she's finally gonna get her apartment back, and Tamara says, look, I'll make us dinner tonight, I'll go out and get some food. Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills, and then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner, and as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 in the morning, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills. But it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. And they're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, your friend, your relative was just found deceased and we need to look around the apartment. Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it. And they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. And there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them.
not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight. She says, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail. Here is the surveillance footage of Tamara disposing of Valentina's body, as well as some shots of Tamara during her trial. 1991, Brian Kendall and his young family were tired of living the busy city life. He worked in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a carpenter by trade, but he and his wife, Belinda, had grown up in the country in West Virginia, and they decided to move back there, even though that would mean a multi-hour-long commute for Brian to get back to Baltimore to do work, because he still worked in Baltimore. So Brian and Belinda start looking for places to live in West Virginia, and they find this nice home in Slanesville, West Virginia, which has a population of 182 people last time I checked. The house itself had more of a cabin feel to it. I mean, it was way out in the middle of this forest, no neighbors anywhere. It was a ranch style, so single floor, and basically everywhere you looked was just pure forest. So this cabin is super isolated, but Brian and Belinda had come from a neighborhood that wasn't very safe, and they didn't like sending their kids outside without supervision. Now, living in the middle of nowhere, they could at least let their kids go outside and not really worry about them. So even though it might have been lonely, they felt like it was at least safe. And Brian went out and got a beautiful, friendly black lab dog to come and protect the property, and her name was Coco. They loved Coco. She was very protective of the kids right away, and she blended in with the family immediately. And very quickly, the family really took to living in Slanesville. They loved their new home and their new life. Everything was just going so well at first. Shortly after they had moved into the house and finally unpacked, Belinda invited her brother, as well as her brother's wife and daughter named Jordan, to come over and check out the house. And so they come over. Belinda had gotten a cake and some balloons, and she planned on throwing a little mini surprise party for Jordan, who was about the same age as her kids and had recently had a birthday, and so they figured they would surprise her, give her some cake, and have a little impromptu birthday party. After cake, the kids went into the living room and were playing in there together. The living room was right next to the kitchen, and so the adults were in the kitchen having coffee and chatting, and as they're chatting, they all noticed something very strange going on in the living room with the kids. The kids had taken all of the balloons and brought them into the living room, and they had all floated up to the ceiling, and there was pretty high ceilings inside of this living room. And as the adults are looking in the direction of the kids and these balloons, they notice one of the balloons comes down from the ceiling, but the string is tight, as if someone's holding the balloon and pulling it down, but no one was pulling on the balloon. The adults stopped talking, and they've all noticed this, and they're all looking at it, because it looked very unnatural. The balloon stops right in the middle of the room, and it's a ways away from the kids, and the kids haven't noticed it. And the parents are just quietly watching this balloon, and no one knows what to make of it. No one's even commenting that this is happening. They're all just quiet and watching. And the balloon starts moving across the room over to where Jordan was. Jordan notices the balloon for the first time. She turns and goes, "Thank you," as if she's talking to someone, but no one's there. She reaches out to take the balloon, and as she goes to grab it, it drifts right back up to the ceiling, as if someone had been holding it and let go of it. And Jordan kind of grabbed for it, watched it go to the ceiling, and then Jordan just turned around and kept on playing. That startled everybody. They could make sense of a balloon coming down and then moving. The helium could be leaking, there could be a draft in the room, but for it to go right back up and look like someone had released it, they couldn't explain that. And so the parents go right in the living room. They're looking at each other. The parents are, and they're like, "Did you see that? What was that about?" And they grab that balloon down from the ceiling, and they're trying to replicate what they saw. And they're kind of looking at each other like, "Are we going crazy?" And they go over to Jordan and they say, "Hey, who were you talking to a minute ago?" And she couldn't really articulate anything. And they said, "When the balloon was right here in front of you, who are you talking to?" And she stops and kind of thinks about it for a second. She's a young kid, she's like 2 or 3 years old. She thinks about it and she points in the direction where no one's standing and goes, "Him." The parents look in the direction of where she's pointing. They look at each other and then they start laughing because they're like, "Okay, we're scaring ourselves. Obviously, the helium must have come out and maybe there's a draft and she's 3. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's probably got an imaginary friend. We're just scaring each other. Let's just drop it. Let's forget the balloon."
And so they do. They forget the balloon and they don't think about it again. But after Jordan and her parents leave, Belinda and Brian would say to each other, like, that was pretty weird. A couple of days later, Brian asked his daughter, Blair, who was about 5 or 6 years old, if she wanted to come with him and go explore the back forest behind their property, because Brian had been working so much, he hadn't really had a chance to go explore, and he figured now's a good chance to go. Blair's super excited. The two of them go out into the backyard and they start walking around. And after walking a bit of a ways, they stop because they see something in the middle of the forest that shouldn't have been there. They see this van, like a vehicle, that looked like it had been set on fire at one point. It's totally charred. It's basically just the frame, and it's parked in the middle of the forest. And there are no roads anywhere. And they go in the back of the vehicle and look inside, and there are all these burnt stuffed animals and kids' toys that are in the back of this van. And there is what looks to be the spring of a mattress that must have been caught up in this fire that burned the vehicle. And Brian just had this sinking feeling that something was wrong with this scene. And he said, hey, you know what, Blair, we gotta go. Let's not look at this. We don't know what this is. Let's just go. When they get back to the house, Brian would tell Belinda what he found. How would that van have gotten there? And why was it there? It just didn't make any sense to either of them. Over the first couple of months that they were living in Slanesville, Brian was trying to commute daily to his work in Maryland, but it was taking up hours and hours of his day. He was getting no sleep, and it just didn't make sense. And so even though they only had one car, he started commuting on Monday morning to work and then staying with his mom, who lived in Maryland, and then coming back to Slanesville on Friday night, which would mean that every week, Monday to Friday, Belinda and the kids would be alone in their cabin in the woods in Slanesville with no vehicle. But Belinda had grown up in a very isolated house in the middle of a forest in West Virginia, so she wasn't a stranger to this type of setup, and so really didn't have any issues with this lifestyle that they had in Slanesville. Blair had been asking ever since they moved in if she could go camping one night out in their RV. They had a little RV camper that was parked right outside their property, and she wanted to spend a night out there by herself. And so one week when Brian was away for work, Belinda finally caved and said, okay, Blair, you can stay in the camper tonight. She wasn't thrilled about this idea, but she felt like the kids had a little bit of cabin fever going on because they were so cooped up in this house, and she figured this is an easy way to make Blair feel a little bit happier living here. So she told Blair, once you go in there, I want you to lock the door and not open it again. And Coco, their dog, is going to stay with you. Blair was just fine with this setup. And so that night she went out to the camper. She had Coco with her. She had all her warm clothes on. She brought a lantern with her and some books she was going to read. She goes out and her mom tucks her into her bed inside of the RV and gives her a kiss, and then she leaves. In the camper, there was a pull-out bed that she was on that took up the majority of the floor space in the camper. On her right, as she was laying down, was a big window with a blackout curtain that slid across the whole thing, and she kept that curtain shut. At the foot of her bed to the right was the door that led into the camper, and there was a window on that as well, but there was no blind to block it. And so at some point, Blair is tired. She turns off her lantern and she gets under her covers with Coco right next to her, and she goes to sleep. At some point in the night, Blair wakes up suddenly because Coco is acting really strange. She's very uneasy, and she's looking towards the door that leads into the camper, and she's acting like she just saw something. So Blair sits up, she's trying to calm down Coco, and she looks at the window on the door. And she can look outside, there's a little bit of moonlight outside, so she's got a little bit of illumination. And as she's looking, she sees what looks like a figure walk past the door. She can't tell if it's a person or if it's an animal or what it is, but she definitely saw something walk past the door. And Coco clearly saw it too, because Coco begins growling, and instead of just looking at the door where this figure was, Coco basically follows the figure and is now looking at the window right next to Blair. Blair thinks it's her mom, and so she tries to calm down Coco. She turns on her lantern and she goes to the front door and she peeks her head out. She doesn't see anything. She unlocks it and opens it and pokes her head out. She doesn't see her, and she goes, "Mom?" And there's no one out there. She looks up at the house, which is right next to her, and all the lights are off. There's no sign that her mom left the house. Suddenly feeling really startled, she shuts the door, locks it, and goes back in her bed. Now, the whole time that Blair had turned that lantern on and gone down to the door and yelled for her mom, Coco was still on the bed looking at the window where the blackout curtains were covering up whatever was on the other side. Now, when Blair's going back to the bed, Coco is showing her teeth. She's baring her teeth and she's growling at the window. Blair's totally spooked. She jumps into her bed, throws the covers over her head, and she's sitting there hoping that Coco will just stop and that this will all end and she can go to sleep, but Coco doesn't stop. And she's like reaching out and trying to pull Coco to get under under the covers with her, but Coco won't stop. Blair decides she has to take a look out that window. And she thinks, maybe it is my mom. Maybe I just missed her before and she's trying to come in. Maybe she was knocking and I didn't hear her. And so she takes her covers off her head, gets right up next to the side of the wall. She's underneath the window, which is right next to her. And she starts pulling aside that curtain. And as soon as she's got a view out the window, she sees a dark figure that looks like a man or something standing right outside the glass, looking down into her camper. She's so scared. She drops the curtain and just gets under her covers. Coco goes right on top of Blair and is standing over Blair, basically protecting her. And at some point, Blair does manage to fall asleep. Meanwhile, on the same night, there was some other drama happening up at the main house. Belinda had put Blair's younger brother, Sean, to bed almost immediately after she tucked in Blair inside of the camper. Sean was 3 years old and he was a great sleeper. She could put him in his bed, say goodnight to him, and she wouldn't see him until the next morning. But that night, Belinda was laying in bed, and Sean multiple times would get out of his bed and come into her bedroom and say he was scared and didn't want to be in his room. Belinda would get up, she'd go back, she'd tuck him back in and say, you got nothing to worry about, it's just a new house, you're fine, you're safe. But on the third or fourth time that this happened, because it was so out of character, she asked Sean, what's going on? What are you so scared of? And he says, there's a monster in my window. Belinda assumes what he means is maybe a deer was outside or some other animal might have walked by the window, because in virtue of being a single-story house, all of the bedroom windows are at ground level. And so she goes to the window and she looks out, and it's just forest, deep, dark forest, everywhere you look. And so she's thinking, okay, maybe a deer walked by the window or a moose or something like that. And that's what he saw. And so she was able to explain to him that, it's just a new house. There's probably some deer that are coming by the window. You got nothing to worry about. And so she was able to finally calm him down and he would go to sleep. The next morning, Blair is relieved to wake up and have sunlight be coming through that little open window on the front door. She and Coco go into the main house. She sits down for breakfast with her mom and with her brother. And Belinda asks her, how was camping? And Blair, who was normally a very chatty child, was very quiet about it. And her mom said, well, did you have a good time? Like, you gonna tell me anything about it? And Blair just said, I don't think I want to go camping again. And she didn't elaborate. She just didn't want to talk about it. And so Belinda didn't ask any more questions, and that was that. That day goes by without incident. And then that night, Belinda gets Sean and Blair to bed in their normal rooms. They're asleep. Belinda goes to her bed and she falls asleep. And she starts to have this very strange dream. In her dream, she wakes up and looks at the foot of her bed and she sees a boy she doesn't recognize. And he's signaling her to come with him. And so in her dream, she gets up out of her bed and she follows him out of her room and she goes out to the front yard, and it's daylight outside. And on her front yard are all these clotheslines strung all over the front yard. And there are these white sheets that are hanging from each of these clotheslines, all in different random directions. And she's trying to find this boy, and she can't find him because all the sheets keep getting in her way. She finally stops because she feels something on her toe. And she looks down, she's barefoot, and on her right big toe is a clothespin that had been pinched onto her toe. And so she reaches down and pulls it off, and that's when she wakes up. And now she's awake in real life. And so she sits up and she's kind of looking around, and she's in that immediate fog following a really vivid dream. And then she realizes that was just a dream, gets back in bed, and she goes to sleep. The next day she gets up, she gets out of her bed, and she begins pulling her blankets up to make her bed. As she's walking around the foot of the bed, she stops because she sees something on the ground. A clothespin. They don't own any clothespins. And so she's sitting there looking at it thinking, how could that have gotten there? What was that dream about? Was I awake? Was I doing something in my sleep? Was I sleepwalking? She can't make sense of it, but it totally freaked her out. That day, Belinda told her sister about this dream with the clothespin and then finding it at the foot of the bed. And her sister's like, look, you probably just need a break. You're alone with the kids all the time. You're isolated. Let me come over. I'll watch the kids and you can just go for a walk and do whatever. Just clear your mind. And so Belinda's sister comes over, takes the kids, and Belinda decides that what she's going to do is go explore the woods behind their house. She walks a little ways behind their property and she sees something that really stands out to her. It was a little cemetery, and it was on their property, or at least close to their property. She goes over to it and sees there are 4 small headstones. There's no writing on them, but the size of the headstone themselves, it seemed to indicate that these could have been children. And so she was very unsettled by it and decided that, you know what, I'm done with my walk and I'm just going to go back now. A couple of days later, Blair was sleeping in her room when she woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. She sat up, she kind of looked around, and she noticed that the curtains that normally would cover up her window that overlooked her bed were open. And she felt really uneasy by this, especially after that incident in the RV. She liked having those curtains closed. So she gets up to go over and shut this curtain, and she looks out the window and she sees standing in front of the tree line is a dark silhouette of a figure. It looks like a man or some person. And she freezes. And she's looking at it, and she can tell that it's moving towards her. And she's looking even closer, and then she can tell it's now running at her. She shuts it, jumps into her bed, and covers herself up. As she's laying there under her covers, not knowing what to do, she hears Coco barking from her mom's room. Belinda wakes up to Coco barking and looks at what she's looking at, and it's the window. So Belinda gets up, she looks out the window, she doesn't see anything, and tells Coco to calm down. She figured, okay, maybe she saw a deer or something. And then just to be a good mom, she checks on her kids. She goes to Sean's room. Sean didn't wake up from the barking. He's asleep in his bed. But when Belinda goes into Blair's room, Blair is hiding under her covers and she's scared of something. And she asks Blair, honey, what's wrong? And Blair finally says that she saw something. She thought it was a person. She didn't know what, but it was running towards the house. And so Belinda's thinking to herself, she just saw an animal. Because that's probably what Sean saw when he thought he saw a monster outside. And I'm sure that's what Coco saw. Coco's going to react to an animal. There's probably some deer that's coming right up to the window, and it's scaring my kids, it's scaring my dog. And so Belinda tells Blair, you got nothing to worry about, honey. Go back to sleep. Everything's going to be fine. She calms her down. She puts her to sleep. She double checks on Sean. Sean's still sleeping. And Belinda and Coco go back into Belinda's room, and they get in bed, and Belinda goes back to sleep. At some point in the night, Belinda's laying with her back to the door, and she feels someone tapping on the back of her head. And she's assuming at this point it's got to be Sean or even Blair who've come in there because they're scared again. And reflexively, without even opening her eyes, she says, honey, there's nothing outside. You get nothing to be scared of. Go back to sleep. There's a silence, and then she feels tapping on her head again. Now she opens her eyes and she rolls over to tell one of her two kids that everything's fine, but there's no one there. It startles her because not only is there no one there, but Coco is now on the bed growling in the direction of wherever this tapping was coming from. Immediately, Belinda flips on the light and she's looking around her room and there's nothing. Gets up and she goes into her kids' rooms. They are fast asleep. Just to be sure, she walks around the house, makes sure everything is locked. She gets back in her bed and she's sitting there with Coco, and she can't help it. She's scared. Between her kids seeing stuff outside, finding that cemetery, the weird clothespin thing going on, now something feeling like it was tapping her, but no one's in the room with her. She's scared. And in fact, she would say in interviews that this was the first time that she even thought about the word haunted in relationship to what was going on at their house. The next day, Belinda just wanted to get away from the house. So she calls her mom and says, hey, can we use your car for the day to go run some errands? Her mom says, absolutely. Her mom drops the car off, and Belinda and the kids load up and they head into town. When they left, they put Coco in her outdoor cage, totally locked and secure. So they head out and they go to this gas station in Slanesville, and Belinda gets out, she's fueling up her car, and another resident of Slanesville pulls up right next to her and she's filling up her car. And the two women strike up a conversation. At some point in this discussion, the woman asks Belinda where she lives in Slanesville because she's a longtime resident and she didn't recognize Belinda. Belinda describes where she lives, and the woman who's familiar with the area says, well, do you know the story of your property? And Belinda's like, no. She's like, well, years and years ago, there was a really bad fire. I think it was right near your property that a whole family died in. And Belinda says, you know what? I actually found a small cemetery a little ways back on our property, but that's what it is. As Belinda is driving away and she's thinking about this story she's been told, she has this sense of relief that now she has some closure on why there's that cemetery on her property. And she couldn't help but think, if her house is haunted, which she had only recently considered, maybe it's not such a bad thing to have it be this family that's doing the haunting. It didn't feel evil, it just felt kind of sad, and she was empathetic for this lost family. When they got back from running those errands, Coco was gone. They went to the fence and it hadn't been opened. There was no sign that she had been able to burrow underneath this fence. There was no way for her to get out unless you opened the gate, and it was locked and shut. And so they didn't know what to make of that, and the only thing they could come up with is someone must have taken Coco. And unfortunately, they would never see Coco again. It was a huge loss for this family. Coco was not only a dog they loved and considered part of their family, but she was also their protection, and it was a very big deal that she was gone. A couple of days go by and Brian's home from work and everyone in the house is asleep except for Belinda. Belinda was up watching TV, and at some point she turns off the TV and she also goes to bed.
She starts having the same dream she had when she felt that clothespin on her toe. In her dream, she wakes up, and at the foot of her bed is this boy, the same boy that she had followed outside that she could never find in the sheets. And so she gets up and she starts following this boy. He brings her out to the front of the house, out onto the front yard. And again, the whole front yard is covered in these white sheets that are strung up along clotheslines. And as she's making her way across the front yard, pulling sheets aside, she finally reaches a clearing and she sees this boy who looks like about the same age as her son, Sean. And this boy looks terrified, and she's looking at him, and the boy is kind of looking to his left. And then from behind one of the sheets next to the boy walks this dark figure that stands right next to him and looks up at her. And it's an expressionless, dark figure. It almost looks like a man. And it starts walking up the lane of sheets towards her. She falls over backwards and she wakes up. And when she wakes up in real life, she hears screaming coming from her own son's room. She and Brian jump up out of bed and run into Sean's room. He's laying on the ground with his arm cocked to the side. It's clearly been broken. And he's screaming and guarding his arm. And Belinda's over him saying, "What happened? What happened?" And the boy just says, "The monster came in the window." They don't know what to make of this. They're not sure if that means an intruder came in or what, but they have to get him to the hospital. They scoop him up, they grab Blair, and they get in the car and they leave. They get Sean to the hospital, and sure enough, he's got a very bad break in his arm and he needs to stay at the hospital for a couple of days. Now, this happened on a Sunday night, and so Brian had to go back to Maryland the next day for work, so their car was gone. So 3 days later, when it was time to get Sean, Belinda had to borrow her mother's car to go pick him up. So Belinda gets her mother's car, and she and Blair drive to the hospital. They pick up Sean. As they're driving back, the car breaks down, and they're on the side of the road with flashers on, and Belinda doesn't know what to do. Luckily, a good Samaritan is driving by. Another resident of Slainsville sees them pulled over. She pulls over. It's an older woman, and she says, "Hey, can I give you guys a ride?" Belinda's like, "Thank you. Yes, we need a ride." So she, Sean, and Blair load up in the car, and they start driving to their house. And so Belinda tells this woman where she lives. "Yep, you take this road, you get up to our house. It's set back in the woods there." And when she realizes where Belinda lives, she looks at Belinda and goes, "You do know the history of your house, right?" And Belinda looks at her and goes, "Yeah, the fire that killed the family, we're aware." She goes, "No, not a fire. The last occupant of your house was rumored to be hurting children on your property. And there's no proof, but some of the local men here decided they were going to take justice into their own hands, and they convinced this guy to go hunting with them. And they brought him out in the woods behind his house, and they ambushed him, and his body's never been found. It's rumored there's a van somewhere in the woods near your house where they put him inside of it, shut the doors, and lit it on fire." Belinda's in shock hearing this, because now, if her house is haunted, which she's believing it is, it's not some nice family that was sadly lost in a fire. It's this horrible man. They finally got back to the house. They said bye to the woman, and Belinda and her kids went inside. And for Belinda, it was like this horrible sense of dread being in the house. It just felt evil. And she realized that she couldn't stay there anymore. So she picks up the phone, she calls Brian, and she says, "I cannot stay here another night. I have to go." And so Brian says, okay. He drives back from Maryland. They pack some bags, they get in his car, and they all leave for Brian's mom's house. And that was it. They never stayed another night at that house. They only went back a couple times to pack up their stuff.
You showed up late in a red dress glow, just on your heels and a kiss too slow. My name on your lips like a secret prayer. I try to stay
That's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to go to the cinema with you to watch a movie that they really want to see, and then proceed to talk incessantly to them throughout the entire movie, and about halfway through, spoil the ending. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and a whole bunch of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. Also, please follow our shop's Instagram page. The username is